Welcome to the Science of Sports Performance, where we discuss the real science of nutrition and exercise, helping you train smarter, fuel better, and perform at your very best. My name is Ben Pressler, and I'm currently an undergraduate student at Brigham Young University, majoring in both nutritional and exercise sciences. I'm pursuing my PhD with the goal of becoming a professor of sports nutrition. Today's episode of the podcast is Nutrition 101. It is the second part of our Nutrition 101 series. Today's topic we're covering is protein. So I hope it'll be a pretty high demand episode. You know, pretty much anybody who's involved in sport and athletics, weight training of any kind is very, very keen on their protein intake. And today we're going to be talking all about protein. If you're not familiar, part one of our Nutrition 101 series is carbohydrates and alcohol. In the future parts of this Nutrition 101 series, we'll cover fats and lipids. We will cover vitamins, minerals, all those different things. You know, my goal is for you guys to be able to get a fundamental understanding of these concepts so that in future episodes of the podcast, and even perhaps as you go and listen to previous episodes of the podcast, you will have a little bit better of an understanding to just understand the more advanced and complicated topics related to sports nutrition and exercise physiology. In today's episode, you can expect to learn about the basic structure of proteins, expect to learn all about amino acids, what they are, why they're important, and then we're also going to talk a lot about what our protein needs are. How much protein do we need to eat in a day? How does our body digest the proteins that we eat? Protein quality, is one protein better than another source of protein? As well as we're going to talk about what could happen if you underconsume carbs, and in a similar regard to that, we're going to be talking a little bit about vegan and vegetarian diets, if it's possible, if it's smart to be healthy while consuming a vegetarian or a vegan diet. With that, we're going to go ahead and get right in and talk about the basic structure of a protein. So first thing you need to know is that an amino acid, as I've already mentioned, and if you're not familiar, is the simplest form of a protein, the simplest component, maybe I should say, the simplest part. Now, a carbohydrate, with maybe it's a long, starchy carbohydrate, very long molecule. If you just chunk it out into individual sections, it's a big, long chain of things called saccharides, or very simple sugar molecules, and proteins are very, very similar. A protein is the name for the long chain of amino acids, and then each of those links in the chain is one amino acid. Now, each amino acid starts with just a carbon molecule, right? Just like in all things organic chemistry, carbon is the base, so it starts with one carbon molecule, and then there are going to be four different things attached to this carbon. The one is just another hydrogen molecule, but all all amino acids have that in common. They have a hydrogen attached to the carbon, but then they have one group which is a carboxyl group, which is COOH, and that H on that carboxyl group can actually be donated into a solution, and that is what is able to make it acidic, the presence of hydrogen. And so that is why we call it an amino acid, is because of that carboxyl, or that carboxylic acid. On the other side of the carboxyl group, you have the amine group. The amine group is nitrogen containing, and that is actually one of the things that is going to set apart proteins from all the other macronutrients, carbohydrates and fats. Carbohydrate, as we've discussed, is a carbon and a water molecule in some quantity, right? Carbohydrate, fat and lipids are much more carbons, and that's why they have so many more calories than carbohydrates and protein, is because there's a lot of carbon-carbon energy stored in one molecule, less hydrate, less water and things in there. But a protein, an amino acid, is the only one that is going to contain nitrogen, and that is actually going to be sort of a recurring theme. One of the ways that we can kind of track the amount of protein that is in our food, as well as how much protein we are losing, is just looking at the nitrogen content of something, the nitrogen balance of our bodies, which is something we'll talk about later in the episode. But nitrogen is only found in proteins. There are other compounds that we could get in our diet that contain nitrogen, and so actually sometimes there have been accounts of protein powder or supplement companies that put these nitrogen containing compounds into their product, into their food, and that makes it appear higher protein, although there's not actually protein. That is, of course, very dishonest. It's not something we're going to be diving into in this episode, but that is possible. However, let's say we're just looking at, how much protein is in chicken and rice, right? Whatever, just your food. You can figure that out by looking at how much nitrogen is in there. So again, central carbon, hydrogen molecule, carboxylic acid group, and then there is an amine group, which is nitrogen containing. And then there is something called the R group. Now, the R group is kind of just a variable. R is a variable, just like you might see X is a variable in algebra. And the R group is what makes the amino acid special. There are lots and lots of different types of amino acids, and everything about those amino acids is exactly the same except for their R group. Now, the R group on the amino acid can have a huge variety in what it's going to be. It can be very, very simple. It could be just an additional hydrogen atom. Or it could be a little more complex, but still simple, like maybe a methanol added onto that. Or it could be, it's very, very complex structure that we call an aromatic amino acid, has, the carbons that form a ring, like a hexagon in the R group. They really can be very, very complicated, or they could be very, very simple. And these R groups are what give the amino acids their different properties. So the R group could be acidic, or it could be basic. There are actually 3 amino acids that are, they have a pH above 7. They are basic. Even though, because of that carboxylic acid, we call it an amino acid, the R group can still cause, this amino acid by itself in solution to be basic, to have a pH higher than 7. And one example as well of an R group is the amino acid called cysteine, has sulfur molecules in its R group. And cysteine is actually present in keratin structure, so for example, your fingernails and your hair. And that is why, maybe if you've ever singed your hair or something like that, it kind of has that sulfury smell, kind of gross smelling egg smell, whatever, is because there is a sulfur content in your hair. Those R groups are what's going to give all the variability to these amino acids. Again, every single amino acid has the exact same carbon, hydrogen, carboxyl group, and amine group, and then they all have an R group that is unique to that amino acid. And oftentimes that R group is what is going to define the way that these amino acids function, behave, interact with each other. Now, as we start linking up these amino acids, we are beginning to form, longer chains. The first thing that we could call something is a dipeptide. Peptide might be something that you've heard of, and, it's very popular. There are peptides that can be used as medicines and all these different things. A dipeptide is just 2 amino acids. So one connects to the other, dipeptide. But then going further, you could have a peptide, which is, again, if you've listened to the Nutrition 101 about carbohydrates, we have a saccharide, which would be the equivalent of the amino acid. Then we have a disaccharide, which would be the equivalent of the dipeptide. Then we have an oligosaccharide, which is like several, 5 to 10 maybe saccharide molecules connected. For an amino acid and for proteins, a peptide is about equivalent to that oligosaccharide. Then you have polysaccharides in carbohydrates, and you have polypeptides in proteins. And then, protein is going to be the very, very longest. So again, from shortest to longest, you start out with amino acids, which of course are just 1. You have dipeptides, which are 2. You have a peptide, which again varies in length, but it could be 5 to 10 to 15. You have a polypeptide, which is longer. And then you have a protein, which could be hundreds, even thousands sometimes, of amino acids all in one chain. Now, one thing that's important to know, though, is that proteins are not straight lines. They do not actually exist in the body as just big, long chains and straight lines. But they have 4 different levels of structures: primary, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary structures. Now, the primary structure is what we've already talked about at this point. It's just 1 amino acid connected to each other. And what actually happens is that the carboxyl group and the amine group of 2 different amino acids will interact with each other in something called a condensation reaction. It's called a condensation reaction because a water molecule is created. So again, our carboxyl group is a COOH, and then our amine group is NH2. Like I said, it was nitrogen containing, but it is NH2. So one of the hydrogens from the amine group and then the one oxygen and the hydrogen from the carboxyl group will break off from the rest of the amino acid. Those will come together to form a water molecule, and then the two amino acids will have been bonded together. Now, regardless of the length, whether it's a dipeptide, a polypeptide, or a fully formed protein, that is going to be the primary structure. The primary structure is simply the sequence of the amino acids. Now, I'm going to, just so I feel like I can have them out in the air and I'm allowed to say them, I'm going to just read off what all of the amino acids are. I don't expect you necessarily to memorize them, but just so that I feel like I've said them once and I can say them again, these are all the amino acids. First off, it's worth saying that there are technically an infinite number of amino acids that you could create. All you would need is a new R group, but there are 20 that we consider in science and in biology because there are 20 amino acids that are essential to the functions of the human body. Those ones are glycine, alanine, proline, valine, leucine, isoleucine, methionine, serine, threonine, cysteine, asparagine, glutamine, aspartic acid, glutamic acid, histidine, lysine, arginine, phenylalanine, tyrosine, and tryptophan. Within those 20 amino acids, there are certain ones that have a non-polar R group, which means they are not positively or negatively charged. Then you do also have ones that are polar but do not have a charge. They're polar for other reasons because there's some sort of a dipole in the molecule. Then you do have positively and negatively charged amino acids. Those are acidic and basic. And then you have 3 amino acids that are aromatic. They are non-polar and they have those aromatic rings in their R group that I mentioned to you earlier as we talked about what an R group was. Moving on from the primary structure of an amino acid, we of course just have the secondary structure. And basically what the secondary structure is that the amino acids themselves, once they have been, bonded to each other through condensation reactions, they are going to just kind of interact with each other and want to move. You can kind of think of them kind of like magnets. If they would have like weak magnets on them, they might just naturally kind of want to curl up or make some sort of a shape. And so the secondary structure of a protein is when the R groups and just the amino acids themselves will interact with each other through hydrogen bonds, which is just when a hydrogen is attracted to another hydrogen that is attached to like an oxygen or a nitrogen. Not to get into exactly what hydrogen bonds are right now. You don't need to know that for the purpose of understanding proteins. But there are things called hydrogen bonds, which are just kind of weak interactions. It's not so much a bond as it is just where the atom likes to sit comfortably. And so the two shapes that will often take place because of that hydrogen interactions as their secondary structure is an alpha helix, and a helix is just a spiral. So it really is these amino acids just spiral up. And the second one is called a beta pleated sheet. And so you can almost just think of like an accordion fold in a piece of paper. That's exactly what it'll look like for these amino acids. They just kind of zigzag back and forth into so in that case, they zigzag back and forth into a pleated sheet, or they could turn on themselves into a spiral. Primary structure is just the chain, the straight line. The secondary structure is either the pleated sheet or the spiral. From there, you can actually have even more, reorganization of these proteins. So a really long protein, let's say it's a alpha helix, it's this big spiral molecule. However, the R groups of those proteins can still interact in other ways. So for example, you remember how I said that some of those amino acids are non-polar, which means they don't dissolve in water, which means they are hydrophobic. If you had an amino acid where many of those R groups, if you had a protein where many of the amino acids or nonpolar and hydrophobic, you might get a tertiary structure where, again, maybe that alpha helix, it kind of clumps up into a ball where all of the nonpolar R groups like to be tucked away into the middle, and then all of the polar R groups that are hydrophilic, they do dissolve in water, they're okay with being in water, are then on the outside. So at this point, it's kind of formed this big, messy ball of yarn. And that's really what it would look like. You could think of, yarn. It's already kind of twisted up, right? So maybe that's our alpha helix. And if you just had a section of yarn and you just kind of balled it up in your hand, that's exactly what a tertiary structure of a protein would look like. The last one, the quaternary structure of a protein, is actually just when multiple proteins combine, they interact with each other, they perform a function together. An example of that in the human body is that of hemoglobin. So a hemoglobin is actually 4 separate proteins, and then those 4 proteins are in their own tertiary structures, but then they come together to to create a hemoglobin molecule, and that hemoglobin then is a protein with a quaternary structure because there are separate proteins that are just working together and interacting with each other. So understanding those 4 levels of structure then, I want to talk about the idea of denaturation of proteins. This is actually a very, very important thing to happen. And as I say denature, I don't know if what comes in your mind if you haven't heard that before, but you can think of it as kind of breaking down. In fact, if that is how you thought of it, that's awesome, that's perfect. Denaturation could be caused by heat, it could be caused by a change in pH, but it is when a complex structure of a protein kind of unfolds into a simpler structure. So let's ignore quaternary structure for now. The denaturation of a quaternary protein would just be those individual proteins breaking apart from each other. But then let's just imagine one protein by itself. It's in its tertiary structure. So it's this big long chain that has then been twisted into a helix or folded up into a pleated sheet, and then it has kind of rolled in on itself, maybe because of a disulfide bond, which is not something I mentioned yet, but is very, very common in biology. So those cysteine molecules, like I said, that have sulfur in them could bond with each other and create a tertiary structure, or maybe it's just the hydrophobic interactions. So it's in that tertiary structure, but then due to heat or due to a change in the pH, those proteins, that tertiary structure of the protein kind of relaxes, and then that protein is able to stretch out. And it could even go further, and rather than being a pleated sheet or a helix, that protein would kind of unwind into its primary structure. Now, denaturation is not going to break apart the primary structure of a protein, but it could produce quaternary, tertiary, and secondary structures. Now, you might think, when does this happen? When does denaturation happen? Why is it important? I said with heat and with pH. Well, when you consume protein, think of what some sources of protein are. Maybe milk, eggs, meat. Well, when you heat the meat or the eggs, as I hope you are doing so, that is actually going to denature the proteins. And one of the reasons that can be beneficial is because if you try to digest a protein where it's in this really big, tight, clumped up ball because of the tertiary structure of that protein, it can actually be very, very hard for us to digest it. And it might actually pass through a large portion of your digestive tract without actually being absorbed into the bloodstream. Of course, that's not what we want. We want it to get into our bloodstream. And so if we can denature the proteins in the food that we are eating, then that can actually make it much more simple and easy and fast to digest, which is good. In the case of protein, we want to be able to adequately digest our protein. And so if you heat up eggs or chicken or meat or anything like that, you cook it, then that heating up of the proteins can denature them. And that is actually why many sources of proteins, when you heat them up, when you cook a chicken breast, when you scramble an egg, it is going to kind of the texture of it, right? It's going to change. An egg gets harder, becomes very firm instead of a liquidy egg when you cook it. The reason for that is because the heat denatures the proteins. And then, well, actually in the case of eggs, because not all proteins will do this, it just happens to be that way because in the food proteins like chicken and eggs, like I've said, but those egg proteins, once they have denatured, will actually coagulate in different it'll actually kind of create an additional structure. And so some of the hydrophobic and hydrophilic interactions of those proteins will cause it to coagulate and become very, very firm. And that is why when you heat up an egg and cook the egg, it will become firm. It's because the protein structure of the proteins in the egg are changing. Now, another way, and actually a very similar example to the egg, but another way that we can denature a protein is by a change in pH, often through acidity. That is actually why spoiled milk will curdle. It's because those bacteria that have caused it to spoil, as they are digesting, the lactose and the sugars in that milk, they create acidic byproducts, and those acidic byproducts, similar to as I've described with the eggs, will denature the proteins in the milk and cause portions of the milk to coagulate. That's how we make cheese, and it is how we make rotten milk. And so, obviously, it is a good idea to try and cook your proteins. Of course, there's a big safety thing and foodborne illness concern in cooking your protein sources. But also, even like raw fish, for example, in sushi, it's considered safe to consume, and I know many of us are not getting all of our protein in a day from raw fish. But if for whatever reason you were, then I might encourage you to cook some of that raw fish, because that heating and that cooking process can help denature those proteins and help you absorb it better. That being said, proteins that do not get fully or even perhaps at all denatured before we consume them, of course, our stomach acid is hydrochloric acid. It is a very, very strong acid. So that acid in our stomach acid might be able to denature some of those proteins and help us absorb them. Another form of denaturation that I'm sure you're all very familiar with is your hair. Now, we all know that maybe you have messy hair. What's one thing that you can do to get it looking better is you can get your hair wet with a little bit of water, and then it will be easier to comb and behave a little better and go where you want it to go so that your hair can look nice. The reason for that is because just the water can actually interrupt some of the hydrogen bonds that are contributing to the secondary structure of the proteins. So they're a little more flexible, they're a little more movable, they are going to behave differently because there's something interrupting those hydrogen bonds. And so when we interrupt the hydrogen bonds causing those alpha helixes and the beta pleated sheets, we're able to comb our hair and do something with our hair that we'd like to do, and then eventually it'll dry, and hopefully it'll dry in the position that we want it to, and then it will be more resistant to change. Now, as we are just talking about the concept of denaturation, I want to talk really quickly about how our bodies digest proteins, because I've just kind of discussed the cooking process, and our stomach acid as well can help denature those proteins. Well, the next steps in our body's digestion of the proteins does still happen in the stomach, and it is through a chemical called pepsin. Now, pepsin is actually the activated form, and the inactive form is called pepsinogen, and the reason it is kept inactive is because what pepsin does is it will take those big, long protein molecules and it will start chopping them up into polypeptides and peptides so that they're more manageable when they get into the intestines. However, if its job is to chop up and essentially destroy proteins, then we wouldn't want, that pepsinogen is stored within cells of the stomach, and then they are excreted into the stomach when we eat, when our hormones and, different parts of our brain tell our stomach that we are eating, it will start to release that pepsin into the stomach. But, if that pepsinogen, or pepsin, I kind of am not using them super correctly as I tell you this, but basically, if there was some molecule sitting in the cells of our stomach that could destroy proteins, well, then it's pretty obvious that it would destroy our stomach. So we store pepsinogen in our stomach lining. Pepsinogen is sent into the stomach, and then when pepsinogen comes into contact with the very, very strong hydrochloric acid in our stomach, then it will be converted from pepsinogen into pepsin, which is the active form. It can start chopping up those proteins that we are eating, and then those polypeptides or peptides that have been created by the pepsin will then move into the small intestine. In the small intestine, we then release other proteases. Proteases is the fancy scientific word for something that continues to chop up and make proteins smaller. The suffix ase, something that is an ACE, is oftentimes, almost all the time, I'm sure in biology, something that is going to chop something up and make it smaller. So there are proteases in the small intestine, such as trypsin or chymotrypsin, or just two examples of some of those proteases. And then rather than just taking those big protein molecules and making them into slightly smaller polypeptides or peptides, they are actually going to be able to chop them up into individual amino acids. In some cases, they will remain small polypeptides or dipeptides. However, the idea is that they will be chopped up into individual amino acids that are very small and very easy to be carried across the lining of the small intestines and then into the bloodstream. Now, if you're not familiar, in the small intestine, it is lined with something called the hepatic portal vein. And basically that is just a big vein, a blood vessel that will take nutrients that have been absorbed into the walls of the small intestine right to the liver. That is hepatic. Hepatic means something related to the liver. So the hepatic portal vein is just a vein that takes blood from the small intestine to the liver. Once all the amino acids, and really all the food we eat, frankly, but once those amino acids are in the liver is going to decide how to use them. Does the liver need proteins for something? Is it going to, convert one amino acid into another amino acid, which is something we're going to talk about in just a second? Is it going to let it go out into circulation in the body, or is it actually perhaps, which is another thing that we'll talk about, going to convert it into like a sugar or use it as energy because it decides that we are not in need of amino acids at that time? That is the digestion process of our proteins. Now, real quickly, one thing that I wanted to touch on is that sometimes people will have some sort of a sickness. Maybe they have reflux of the stomach acid, and so they will be taking things that will help reduce the acidity of the stomach acid, so to help with the pain and the discomfort of that. Sometimes people will have just lower stomach acid in general, and so could that actually prevent you from absorbing protein fully? Actually, yes, because your stomach acid might not be so acidic that pepsinogen is activated into pepsin, and it might not even be acidic enough to denature some of the proteins that you are consuming. So that is something that you could keep in mind and consider. On the flip side of that, I have had people kind of ask me, they're like, well, if maybe having low stomach acid is bad, like if I'm trying to get really big muscles and, eat a ton of protein, get really high muscle protein synthesis, could I take caplets of acid, or could I take some food supplement that's going to increase my stomach acid? And I love where their heads are at, but no, you're not going to be able to really take anything you shouldn't be taking, and I don't think safely you could take anything that is going to increase the acidity of hydrochloric acid. That is an incredibly strong acid. Your body's got it under control. If you do have one of those diseases or something wrong with you that is reducing the acidity of your stomach acid, then my recommendation would probably just be to eat smaller meals more frequently, and I think that will help you be able to adequately absorb the protein in your meals. And then, of course, as I'm sure you already know, definitely talk to your doctor if that's something you're concerned about, is your protein intake and your protein goals and your protein digestion. Now, going back to amino acids, the next thing I want to talk about is essential versus non-essential amino acids. Now, I've already said that we are considering 20 amino acids as being essential for human function. However, of those 20, there are 9 that we consider essential in the sense that it is essential that we get them in our diet. Our body cannot create them. And then there are 11 that are non-essential. So again, there are additional amino acids on top of that perhaps are not essential for, the functioning of the human body. And one example is L-theanine. That is one that has been known to kind of stimulate GABA in the brain and help you calm down, help you relax. It's kind of a sleep supplement. That's not one of these 20 amino acids. It is theanine, whereas threonine is actually one of the 20 amino acids. And sports supplements, all these different things, often contain these specialized amino acids, carnitine, and all those different things. Anyways, you have ones that maybe our body doesn't need to function. You have these 20 that it does need to function. However, of those 20, there are 11 of them that though the body needs to have them, it does not need to get them from the diet because it can make them from other amino acids. 9 of them, however, have to be consumed in the diet. Those 9 are histidine, isoleucine, leucine, lysine, methionine, threonine, phenylalanine, tryptophan, and valine. Now, those 9, you have to get them from your diet, whether that is from dairy or from eggs or from meat. If you're not getting those 9 amino acids from your food, then you're not getting them. The body can't create them. The other 11, which I'm not going to name just for the sake of you're not going to remember it anyway, but the other 11 can actually be created if you're not getting them in the right ratios. And that is through a process called transamination. Basically what can happen is if you have the carbon skeleton, if you have, going back, you know the structure of an amino acid now. If you had everything except for the amine group, then your body is able to attach an amine group. It would transaminate it, meaning it would take it off of one amino acid, and then it would add it onto another compound to create an amino acid with this amine group. It would then be able to have a new amino acid that it didn't have before. Now, one example is pyruvate. Pyruvate is a molecule that is formed. There are 2 pyruvate molecules formed when a glucose molecule is split in half. It is a very, very common part of cellular respiration and how our cells get energy from the food that we eat. If you were to transaminate a pyruvate molecule, it would create the amino acid alanine. And so, actually on the flip side, if you have excess alanine that your body doesn't really need for any functions and it wants to create energy out of that amino acid, it could actually just deaminate that alanine, and then you'd have a pyruvate. And as we know, pyruvate is a huge part of cellular respiration, so it would be very, very straightforward, actually, in that case, for our bodies to get energy from an alanine, because it would make a pyruvate. Now, that is just how that would work. Our bodies only create the carbon skeleton. When I first learned about this a while ago, I thought that, perhaps you could just take one amino acid and then break off the R group and then attach a different R group, but that's actually not how our bodies work. What they'll do is they make the carbon skeleton, everything except for the amine, and then they will take the amine group from a different amino acid and transaminate that carbon skeleton. And that will in turn create those other 11 non-essential amino acids. You could eat 0 of those 11, and if you ate the other 9, of course, in sufficient quantities, then you would be able to still get all of the protein that you needed in your diet. Now, there are actually some that are considered conditionally essential. The 9 and the 11 are the essential and the non-essential for just a healthy adult. However, 2 examples of when an amino acid might be conditionally essential, meaning you might actually need to get one of the non-essential proteins in your diet, is, for example, if somebody has something called phenylketonuria, which is the inability to process the amino acid phenylalanine. I actually don't know much about this disease, but I know it can be pretty annoying for that reason. You don't have the ability to process phenylalanine. Well, tyrosine is one of the non-essential amino acids. Phenylalanine is one of the essential amino acids because your body can't create it. But tyrosine is made from phenylalanine. They're both aromatic amino acids. And so if you have the inability to process phenylalanine, so you can't really eat any phenylalanine, well then in that case, tyrosine would become conditionally essential for you because there's no other way for you to get it other than just to eat it. Another example of these conditionally essential amino acids is actually, it's been found that in premature infants, those infants that are born, well before their due date, they might actually be able to make some of these non-essential amino acids, but oftentimes not fast enough and not in the quantities that their bodies need. Obviously, infants grow very, very rapidly, so they need to get a lot of protein to grow a lot of new tissues. premature infants especially, and even just some infants, they're not able to produce those amino acids just fast enough or enough of those amino acids to be able to function the way they need to. So in their case, they would be conditionally essential, at least in some quantity, right? Maybe not all of them that they need, right? But it is conditionally essential that they consume some of them in their diet. At this point, we probably have a pretty good understanding of proteins and their structure and what they do, what they're made out of, where they come from, where they're going, why they're here. Anyways, what I want to talk about now is how much should we be eating? How much protein do I need to get in my diet each day? That is a very, very common question and a very good question. Good question to be asking. First thing I want to start off is say that the body is actually very, very good at recycling amino acids and proteins that are broken down. For example, if cells die and break down throughout the day, and one very simple example is actually the lining of the intestines will often kind of slough off and break down. Well, and then they're in the digestive tract, so we can actually just absorb them back. Maybe that sounds a little gross to you. It sounds a little gross to me, but we can actually just reabsorb them through the intestinal walls and get them back into the bloodstream. That actually happens all the time, all throughout the day. It is estimated that an adult's body is able to recycle 250 to 300 grams of protein a day. I mean, that's very, very valuable resource to our bodies, right, for the creation of cells and tissues. So it is actually very, very good at recycling some of the protein that would otherwise be lost. The RDA, or the recommended daily allowance for protein set by the FDA, is 0.8 grams of protein each day per kilogram of body weight. That is, in imperial units, that is going to be 0.36 grams of protein per pound. So if you were 200 pounds, then that would mean you only had to eat about 72 grams of protein a day. Now, that actually might seem very, very low to many people. 200-pound guy is a pretty big guy. Is he really okay to be eating only 72 grams of protein? Especially, what about someone smaller? What if someone's only maybe like 120 pounds? Well, then that person would only need to be consuming probably call it 40 grams of protein in a day. Does that seem right? Well, it is actually right. And let me tell you how this RDA was set. It seems very, very low, but the first thing to understand is that the RDA was set simply at the level that would be needed to preserve our nitrogen balance. So again, as I've mentioned, nitrogen is only found in proteins. And so in the course of a day, really all that matters to maintain our health is that the amount of nitrogen that is lost in our body each day is replenished back into our body through food. And then that would be a net zero nitrogen balance, right? You are losing just as much as you eat. So the amount of nitrogen in your body day after day after day is going to stay the exact same, which is perfect. Now, there are obviously many people who don't just want to have a perfectly zero nitrogen balance, but they're trying to build muscle, or at least they're hoping to build muscle, or maybe they just want to err on the side of caution, and so they want to make sure that their nitrogen balance doesn't become negative, because if your nitrogen balance does become negative, then you are going to lose muscle in other tissues that are going to have to be broken down because you haven't consumed enough protein, right? Or rather, I should say, the ones that are broken down are not going to be able to be replenished and rebuilt because you have not consumed enough protein to do that. And so many people like to consume more protein just to err on the side of caution. And so I think that's a great idea, but just so that you know, the RDA is only set. It's not an RDA for athletes or bodybuilders. It's just an RDA for the average Joe. Now, the way that this RDA was set was actually through a nitrogen balance study at the University of California at Berkeley. It is actually done in the 70s during the Vietnam War by conscientious objectors. So it was men who were drafted into the military but refused to fight. They did not want to kill or harm anybody. They were objectors to the war. And so I think in some cases, I might be getting some of the historical facts wrong here, but basically they were given the option to actually either go to jail for, denying their draft status that they were sent out, or some of them were given the option to participate in like research studies. And so they were put into a metabolic ward at UC Berkeley called the Penthouse, nicknamed the Penthouse. And I bet you it might have been a little bit gross, but basically in this metabolic ward in the Penthouse at UC Berkeley, every single bit of hair that they shaved off their face and, excrement that they got rid of off of their bodies and anything was kept and collected, and everything that they got to eat was measured. And so they tracked how much nitrogen these people were losing, and they tracked how much they were giving them, and they used those values and adjusted those values until they were able to get to the point where these men in the metabolic ward were losing the exact same amount of nitrogen that they were consuming, which is kind of a crazy study. It's not something that I would like to be a part of. But anyways, in this study, what they actually found was that it was 0.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight, whereas I told you that the RDA was 0.8. This study found 0.6. Well, if you're familiar with statistics, if you're familiar with a bell curve, that is a normal distribution curve, and it kind of tells where the population lies according to some average. And so basically what they did is that rather than doing 0.6, which is average, meaning by definition it should be enough for about half of the population, and the other half of the population would be above 0.6. So they went up 2 standard deviations, which would then cover about 98% of people, and 2 standard deviations for them got the value of 0.8 grams per kilogram. So there is a 98% chance that that is a sufficient protein intake for you. Again, now some considerations of this Penthouse study. First of all, they were in a metabolic ward. There might not have been a lot for them to do. I'm sure they were not being super, super active. Whereas if you are being super, super active, even just to maintain a nitrogen balance of 0, not to be losing more nitrogen than you consume, might need to be higher than that already, right? But again, the idea is that the 2 standard deviations are to protect us. That's actually how all of the RDAs are set for vitamins and for minerals. You find what the average person needs, and then you go up 2 or 3 standard deviations to make sure that most people, the vast majority of people, are going to be okay consuming that level because of just the statistical odds. And if there's a very low chance that you're higher than that, and if you are, you can take that into account. Many of us do consume higher than the RDA for vitamins and minerals and protein. Now, obviously, this 0.8 grams per kilogram, 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight is very, very easy to hit. I weigh, let's call it 100 kilograms. That is 80 grams of protein in a day. That is really not that much, right? If you are consuming just 20 or 30 grams at breakfast, lunch, and dinner, which is actually a pretty small portion of protein for one meal, it's very easy to get more than that. Then there you go. That is me hitting the RDA for protein consumption. It's very, very easy to hit. However, many, many people, as I've said, want to maintain a higher protein balance. And as it is pretty easy to do so, what I usually recommend is a bare minimum is let's go back. That is, I'm going to be saying all these in grams per pound of body weight because I live in the United States, and that is just kind of how my brain thinks. I'll try to include both, but 0.8 grams per kilogram is 0.36 grams per pound. And so my bare minimum is actually 0.5 grams per pound, meaning if you were 100 kilograms is about 220 pounds. That takes you from 80 grams of protein that you should be eating to 110. It ought to be very, very sufficient. It, especially, depending on your activity, there's nothing wrong with going higher, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But that to me is the minimum. Take your body weight in pounds, and then you should be having half of that number in protein. Now, in all of these recommendations, it is worth saying that that is a lean body mass, perhaps not if, your actual fat-free mass, but just a healthy body weight. So if you weigh 400 pounds because you are morbidly obese, you don't need to be having 200 grams of protein necessarily, because if you were to lose, fat and adipose tissue is not going to contribute much at all to your protein needs. And so you could just be eating the same amount of protein as a 200, 250 pound person. The next bracket, I guess you could say, of protein consumption that I wanted to talk about is 0.75 grams per pound of body weight. I don't know what that is in kilograms per body weight, but 0.75, so 3/4 of a gram for every pound, is actually what I consider to be something of a sweet spot. If you're an athlete, if you're a recreational athlete, you enjoy sports, you're trying to be healthy, you're trying to be fit, but maybe it's not something you obsess over, you're not professional or whatever, I think that this is a very, very good spot for you to be at, that 3/4 of a gram per pound. So let's say, again, you're 200 pounds. That would be 150 grams of protein each day. That is actually, at this point, about double the RDA, which is already set to be plenty. So I think, in regards to, obviously you want to make sure that you're in a positive or at least a neutral nitrogen balance. You want to be careful. You want to err on the side of caution, right? But the one advantage to this over consuming even higher, which is very, very common for some people to do, is that it might actually be kind of easy to fit that into your diet. Easier. Maybe it just feels a little bit more normal for you. So again, break that down. You're 200 pounds, you're eating 150 grams of protein. Well, we know that 1 gram of protein yields 4 calories. So if you're having 150 grams, that is 600 calories. Now, if you're a 200-pound person, you're trying to eat at a caloric maintenance, you're probably eating about 2,500 calories, maybe even 3,000 calories a day. And so for only 600 of that to be contributed to protein, you're eating 1,900 to 2,400 calories of just carbs and fats. So I think it's going to be a much more balanced diet, very enjoyable for people. A lot of people don't like to just be eating, their meat and vegetables, but they like to have some carbs and some fruit and maybe even some room at night for some sort of a treat that you enjoy, like ice cream or cookies or whatever, crackers, it doesn't matter. You want to have enough room in your diet to be able to kind of enjoy it a little better than just eating a ton of protein, whereas this is still a super adequate amount of protein to be consuming in a day. One of the advantages of this as well is that of amino acid quality and limiting amino acids. Now that's something that we're going to come back to the idea of protein intake in just a second, but that's something that I want to explain here so that you can understand why that could be an advantage. Now, the human body is going to want to consume and have amino acids available in certain ratios and in certain quantities. And so maybe, your body kind of has a favorite. I'm not saying it's unique to people. It's not. It should be the same for everybody. But it wants to have a lot of one amino acid, whereas you're consuming a lot of another one that it doesn't really care for so much. And especially if they are, essential amino acids that you're missing out on, that could be a really, really big problem. And so if you actually consume, enough protein, but you're doing it from poor protein sources and you're not getting those amino acids in the ratios that they want to be, then it could actually not really be the same as eating the amount of protein that you are supposed to, because your body wants quantities of the amino acids. And if you're consuming more and more and more, perhaps, above the RDA or above what your body needs, however have you, but again, you're doing it in the wrong amino acids, it could be almost pointless, right? If your body's not able to create those essential amino acids that it wants to get. Now, there are ways that we can measure the protein quality of a food, and I'm sure it's not going to surprise you at all when I say things like eggs and meat are very high-quality protein sources, meaning the amino acid ratio that we get from eating those foods matches very, very similarly to what our body wants to have. In fact, the perfect protein is egg white. That is, you can imagine that is a protein that is used for an animal to be, a little baby chicken is going to try and grow all of its body tissues based on this egg white. It's probably pretty simple to understand that the amino acid ratio of that egg white then is going to be very ideal for tissue, for the human body, for growing muscle and things like that, right? Whereas if you go to other things like grains, for example, so wheat and rice and oats, they have some small amount of protein. I love oatmeal. It's probably my favorite carb source. So every day I love to have a bowl of oatmeal. And I think it's a few hundred calories, but it still is going to have about 1000. It's going to have about 10 grams of protein in it, which is awesome. It's a great way to kind of contribute to my overall protein intake. However, if all of my protein came from grains and oatmeal and things like that, as it might for someone who's living a vegan or vegetarian diet, that could be a problem because the amino acid ratios in those grains and in those plant products are not going to be quite the same as what my body needs. Now, there are different ways we can measure this. One of them is called the biologic value, which is actually just a measure of if we feed somebody this protein source and it has this much nitrogen, how much nitrogen are they going to excrete? Like, are we going to be able to absorb and use it all, or are we going to kind of waste some of it and it's going to end up in the urine or the feces? Another one that I think is interesting is called the protein efficiency ratio, which is actually they will feed this protein source to a lab rat, and then they will see how much body weight the lab rat puts on because of consuming that protein source. There are some ones like that. You don't really need to know them. In some cases, they can even be a little goofy, I think. But basically, what really matters is just the amino acid ratios and the digestibility. Now, if you're not able to fully digest a protein, maybe because it didn't get denatured enough, you don't have enough stomach acid, or sometimes actually like the grains and things, if they have like a lot of fiber that is not able to be digested, there could be some protein kind of held on to that fiber and sort of that same bolus of food in your intestines, so it might not be able to be digested as well. So depending on how well your body digests it and the amino acid ratios is going to depend whether or not it is a good protein source. If you are somebody who is following, for example, a vegan diet, some very common protein sources for vegans are like beans, a pretty good source of vegan protein, as well as nuts and grains. However, each of those protein sources is actually going to be specifically low in one amino acid. So if you ate all of your protein from that, you're not going to be able to meet those amino acid needs. So beans, for example, are low in the amino acid methionine. Nuts and grains are low in the amino acid lysine. So it is possible to live a vegan and a vegetarian lifestyle. You do need to be very mindful of the foods that you're eating to make sure that you can get enough protein. But in addition to that, you need to make sure that you're eating a variety of different sources. So for example, if you're just eating nuts and grains as your sources of protein, you're going to be pretty low on lysine. So you can include other sources such as beans, and then soybeans and like tofu is actually a complete protein source. It has all 9 of the essential amino acids. So it is considered, that's why it's such a popular protein choice for people living a vegan and a vegetarian lifestyle. Going back then to why eating more protein might be beneficial in that regard, it's because let's say you're eating 0.75 grams of protein per pound that you weigh, you're 200 pounds, and you eat 150 grams of protein. Well, if you're consuming that much protein, let's say you are consuming foods that are limited or low in amino acids, if you eat enough total protein, it might not really matter so much, You are able to, you've eaten so much total protein that even though maybe some of your sources were low in amino acid, it kind of canceled out and you got enough at the end of the day so that your body doesn't have any deficits in these amino acids that it's hoping to get, and you're going to be okay because you ate enough total protein. What that actually kind of reminds me of is Dr. Lane Norton, a nutritional scientist. He kind of did his PhD thesis talking a lot about leucine. Leucine is something called a branch chain amino acid, which is, maybe I can go into a little detail in this in a second, but basically it is an amino acid that is responsible for the signaling pathway that will lead to muscle protein synthesis. And he did a lot of his PhD work and a lot of his studies about how an increased leucine consumption in the diet can help promote muscle building and is more beneficial for muscle building. However, one of the things he points out is that that matters much more the less total protein that you eat. If you are a vegan or a vegetarian, or if you are eating a pretty low protein diet closer to the RDA, then yeah, the amount of leucine you get in your diet is going to matter a lot to make sure that you are able to build muscle the way that you might hope to. Whereas if you just eat more total protein, then it's not really going to matter so much, because you're probably going to get enough total, maybe not in the same ratio, right? Maybe not in the ratio that your body wants it, but you've gotten enough total that there is some amount of protein in the ratio that your body wants it to be at. And actually on that note right there, I want to talk about branched-chain amino acids briefly. They are a common sports supplement that you'll find. I have had lots. I have some right now. We'll talk about why. Well, basically, branched-chain amino acids, the three of them are leucine, as I've said, isoleucine, and valine. Now, they have been shown to signal something called mTOR, which stands for, you don't need to remember this, the mammalian target of rapamycin. And anyways, that mTOR pathway gets signaled by leucine, as well as mechanical tension and the stresses of resistance and strength training. And then that complex is going to start signaling for and initiating muscle protein synthesis. It's going to help us to grow muscle. And so it makes total sense to me that you want to be consuming a lot of those branched-chain amino acids to start signaling mTOR to begin muscle protein synthesis so that you can get as big and as strong as you possibly can. Now, what has been shown in the more recent years, though, is that you do not need to be consuming the branched-chain amino acids specifically through a form of supplement to be able to get that. What matters most, and what I'm going to tell you, and I'll agree with you, is the most important thing is your total protein intake. Probably the second most important thing is that you're getting it from quality sources like meat and fish and eggs and dairy. And then aside from that, if you're doing that, there's not really much more that consuming a specific branched-chain amino acid supplement is going to do for you. That being said, I sometimes like to have branched-chain amino acid supplements just because, it is still protein. It's amino acids, right? It still can definitely help in the same way that protein would, right? You can think of it like a protein shake. They usually have 9 or 10 grams of amino acids in each serving. But, if you're having a whey protein, it's a very milky, dairy flavor, right? So you can get vanilla and you can chocolate and things like that. And I don't mind that. I have whey protein all the time. But one thing I do like about the branched-chain amino acids is a lot of times they have a little bit more of like a juice flavor. You can get them in watermelon. I have one that's green apple right now. You can get them in all sorts of fun, more fruity flavors. And so sometimes it's just something that I enjoy to have because it's a way to change it up, way to get a different tasting protein supplement. Though the data appears to show that you really don't need those specific amino acids in excess to stimulate more muscle protein synthesis. That's not exactly how it works. The last intake guideline that I want to talk about is 1 gram per pound of body weight. This is very popular, I think, in big part because obviously the math is very easy, and there's really no way you could say at this point that you are not consuming enough protein. Now, that would be, I can do the math for this one, this is pretty easy, but it is 2.2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. And I guess backtracking, my minimum recommendation would be 1.1 grams of protein per kilogram. My moderate recommendation would be 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. At this point, it is 2.2 grams per kilogram, or 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight. This is almost 3 times the RDA for protein. And there are even people that consume more than that. There are people that consume 1.25 grams. There are people I've even heard that consume 2 grams of protein per pound of body weight a day. And I don't recommend that. I really don't. I don't think you're hurting anything, but it's not like the more and more and more, if you just like overdose yourself with protein, that you are just going to get more and more and more benefits. As I've already mentioned, if you have an excess of protein and your body doesn't really have anything to do with it, it doesn't really have a storage place. You could consider, your muscles perhaps as a place to store protein, but that's not just how it works. Just because you have more protein doesn't mean that your body is going to store it in your muscles by making more muscles, whereas just your muscles is where you're going to get protein from if you are not eating enough. Anyways, you're not going to get some magical benefits from just super over consuming protein. So actually kind of the most I'll recommend to somebody is about 1 gram per pound of body weight. Now, I've made a diet for myself recently that I've been following, and again, I weigh about 220 pounds, and so that would be 220 grams of protein. And I think in this diet I made for myself, I think it came out to like 230, just because, there are foods that I enjoyed eating, and they happen to have a little more protein and things like that. I'm not like worried about that. I'm not saying you can't or you shouldn't. Something you might want to know is that, again, more of that protein might be going to waste, right? And you might just be oxidizing it and using it for gluconeogenesis, which is the formation of glucose, or even liponeogenesis, the formation of fatty acids. And so what I mean to say by that is just that you might be consuming a more expensive form of carbohydrates, right? Protein is definitely the most expensive food group. It's relatively cheap to get, nut butters and oils for fats, and it's very cheap to get any sorts of starches and sugars for carbohydrates, right? But protein, meat, dairy, eggs are going to be much more expensive on average. And so if your body's just converting it into carbohydrate, you might just be able to save yourself a little bit of money on your grocery bill. Now, one reason you might want to consume this much protein is because, protein is kind of a diminishing return, right? It's kind of going to go out and plateau. So the more you have, it doesn't necessarily mean more benefit in the same proportion to which you consume it, right? If you go from 100 to 150 to 200 to 250 grams of protein in a day, that 50 gram of protein increase each time, at first is going to have a pretty good benefit for your muscle protein synthesis and all those things you hope for. Then it's going to get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And so for a lot of people, it just doesn't make sense. However, there are some people, and I think one very notable example of this would be natural bodybuilders and powerlifters, people who want to be really high-performing athletes without the use of any sort of anabolic agents or steroids. Those types of people might want to just try and get every single little bit of extra benefit that they can from eating protein and taking the supplement that they can. They want to kind of aggregate those little marginal gains. If they can stack up those little tiny bits of better progress, then it can help them in a real way. And so in that case, eating much more protein like that could be a great idea. I put myself in that boat. I want to be very, very strong. I want to have big muscles. I want to be a successful bodybuilder and powerlifter, but I don't take any sorts of anabolics. And so for me, I enjoy the way I eat when I eat a gram per pound of body weight. I like the food that I eat. I'm able to afford it. And so for me, it kind of makes sense. I think I could be still fine eating less if I did, 3/4 that I've discussed. But for me, this makes sense. For many people, it makes sense. It's not something that we dislike. If you do dislike it and you're not able to stick to your diet and things like that because you don't like to eat that much protein, that's okay. That's one of the things that I was trying to say to advocate for 0.75, is that you might just have an overall better diet that you enjoy more. And that can be a huge, huge benefit in that regard. Another benefit is just the fact that protein is very satiating, or it makes you feel full, right? And also, if you're consuming a lot of protein, it kind of just helps you be mindful of your meals. If you're having a lot of protein, your meals kind of need to revolve around protein. And then at that point, it just, for some people, it's a mental thing. It helps them feel like they're eating better and just make better food choices overall. So especially if you're someone who is trying to, lose weight, for example, and that helps you feel full and be mindful of what you're eating, then just eating that much protein could be very beneficial in that regard. Another thing, this is something that I actually think is pretty cool, is just that when you are in a calorie deficit, especially, the steeper the calorie deficit, the higher the calorie deficit, the more true this is. And it's just that when you are in a calorie deficit, some of that protein is never even going to get the chance to be incorporated into muscle tissue, right? So after it's digested and it makes it to the liver, if you're in a really steep calorie deficit, your liver might get to the point where it's just like, hey, we need energy right now. We don't need more protein, but we need energy. And just in the liver, before it even gets to the tissues of the body, it is broken down and used for energy. And so if you do hope to get enough protein to the body cells to maintain muscle mass and all those different things, to tissue health, just to get the protein that you need, you might need to increase your protein intake just to make sure that that protein is actually doing what you want it to do in your body. Now, the reason that it's kind of tricky, you might say, well, what if I just eat less protein and eat like more carbs? Because then my body won't need protein for energy. It'll just use the carbs for energy. And that is true. I think there is some truth to that. However, you're also just in a calorie deficit. So even if you did replace that with carbs, you're still going to be at the point where your body is wanting more energy than you're feeding it. And so there is still a good chance that it's going to oxidize or just use the protein in another way. And so that could be a benefit of eating this much protein as well. I think that is pretty high. I don't think it's a bad recommendation, but also, again, I don't really recommend anyone go higher. I just think it's kind of pointless and needless at that level. Another thing that is important to consider is protein timing. Not just how much protein should I eat, but when should I eat my protein? Now, before I talk about this, I am going to tell you that the most important thing is how much protein you're eating. If you're eating enough, it doesn't super matter when you eat it and in what quantities and how much throughout the day, right? A long time ago, kind of back in bodybuilding culture, I want to say in the 80s, 90s, it was thought that just a ton of small meals with protein every day is what's going to be the best, because it's kind of like you're constantly infusing your blood with protein all day long, all the time. So a lot of people would have, like 6 or 7 or 8, just the very small meals all throughout the day, so they could continually be feeding their body protein. Whereas nowadays, it's been more popular in the recent years to do things like intermittent fasting, where you are having just 1 or 2 very, very large meals, kind of the opposite of that 8 small meals, right? And which is going to be best? Are they as effective as each other? Is one better? The first thing that you need to think about is just, what is your priority, right? Are you the one who is trying to get the biggest, strongest muscles possible? Or are you just trying to be healthier? You're trying perhaps to lose weight and get a little more fit and healthy and strong because historically you've been overweight, right? If that's the case, well then you don't need that constant IV drip into your bloodstream of protein all day long, but really you just want to worry about how you're able to manage your caloric intake, right? And so I did intermittent fasting for a while. I liked it. I definitely felt like it helped me control the total amount of calories that I ate in a day. So I can definitely understand people who enjoy it and it's something that they want to engage in. And even though, maybe it's not quite as good for your muscle protein synthesis and things, that's not really what your goal is. For you in those shoes, it's better for you to just lose weight and have good muscle protein synthesis than to have other, things that are going to affect your personal weight loss journey and have really, really high muscle protein synthesis. So it just kind of depends what you are. It's like back when I said, if you are the guy, the natural bodybuilder, natural powerlifter who just wants to get every single competitive advantage, then maybe those 8 small meals are going to be more beneficial for you. I actually still think 8 is a lot. I would probably not eat more than 6 times in a day. My personal eating patterns, I think I have 3 meals and then I have probably 2 snacks. So I guess that's 5. And I'd say probably at breakfast I consume about 40 grams of protein. Between my snacks, I'm probably eating about 50. And then, at lunchtime, probably about 60, and at dinner time 70, which is going to come out to about 220. So that's probably what I'm eating in a day, and obviously I think that is a happy medium. I think it'll work for a lot of people. I think it's a very, very, 3 meals and a couple snacks is a very average eating pattern for many people, and I think that's going to be great. But one thing that I wanted to talk about in regards to this protein timing is a study that came out a little while ago, not long ago now, and it has been getting a lot of buzz. It's very, very popular. You might have even heard of it. It is called, the anabolic response to protein ingestion during recovery from resistance training. I didn't actually write down the entire title because it's very, very long. But it's the anabolic response to protein ingestion during recovery from exercise does not have an upper limit, is the name of the study. And so that kind of tells you exactly what you hope to get out of it. And I think I've seen a lot of these videos that people made covering this study, and I think that a lot of the people who made these videos didn't read it. They don't actually know what it says. I think at best, maybe they read the abstract, but I think a lot of times people might have just seen somebody else's video that was talking about it, or even just seen the title for this study. It's very easy for someone to go, oh, well, this study is called the anabolic response to protein ingestion during recovery from exercise, not have an upper limit. Well, there you go. It's true. You can just do one gigantic meal a day because there's no upper limit. And I mean, to me, that made sense. I kind of always held that opinion about intermittent fasting. And to me, the analogy that I kind of drew in my mind is like, how much water can you fit into a glass? Well, it depends on how big the glass is, right? It depends on how much water is already in there. And so if your glass is like very, very full, say you've been eating protein all day long, and then you try and have, a huge protein feeding at night, how much protein or water can you fit into that glass? Well, not very much because it's pretty full. Whereas if it's pretty big cup and it's pretty empty and it's pretty dry, and you want to put that same amount of, big protein feeding water into that glass, then it's probably going to go much, much better. And I think there's some truth to that. I don't know if I necessarily have a great way to scientifically back up the analogy that I just painted for you, but that's kind of always been my feeling. So it made sense to me, but as this study was getting a lot of hype and energy, and I decided to read it. I read the study, and let me tell you, it was a complicated study. I had a hard time reading it. It took a lot of mental energy for me to try and understand the concepts that it was expressing. And so it's not as straightforward of a study as people think it was. And so what they did is it was crazy the way that they did this study. They actually injected a cow with isotopically labeled proteins. So there are these proteins, these amino acids, that have a certain compound in that amino acid that is an isotope, right? So it's the same element, but it has a different number of neutrons, and that allows the scientists to measure the quantities of it. And they injected that isotopically labeled amino acid concentrate or amino acid solution into this cow, and then they took the milk from that cow that they had injected, and they made a whey protein supplement from the milk of that cow so that the milk that came from that cow would then be isotopically labeled. And then after they made whey protein out of it, they had the volunteers of this study, and the volunteers did exercise. They gave them this whey protein that had been made from the special cow, and then they were able to use the isotope labeling to track how well that whey protein was being digested in different levels of consumption. Now, the two groups that they had, one consumed 25 grams of protein, the other group consumed 100 grams of protein in this post-exercise recovery period. Then what they did is they sent an IV infusion of amino acids into these people. So, they had an IV in their blood vessels, and they were sending isotopically labeled amino acids into their blood. Now, the reason they did that was to measure how much of the amino acids, how well the amino acids were being incorporated into muscle protein, right? So this was their way of measuring muscle protein synthesis. Now, you might think that would kind of confound the study, right? One group gets 25 of the whey protein, one group gets 100 grams of the whey protein, but then they both get the IV protein. Doesn't that mess anything up? And the answer is no, actually. Through that IV, you only get actually like milligrams of protein, and that's all you need to measure the muscle protein synthesis. And so it wouldn't confound the study at all. What really matters is the 25 grams of ingested protein versus 100 grams of ingested protein. And what they found, well, as the title has said, they found that there was no upper limit. It used to just be kind of held. They talk about this in the study. The idea was that the more protein you eat, the more protein gets broken down and wasted and used for energy. Oxidized is the scientific word, but they thought it was pretty straight of a correlation. The more you eat, the more it gets wasted. And what they found was that was not the case. The 100-gram of protein group had a much better protein response than the 25 grams of protein group. However, if you look up this study, if you look at the graphs, the data that they present, the 100-gram protein group, obviously they consumed 4 times the amount of protein, and they saw about a 2 times increase in muscle protein synthesis and in the absorption of the protein into the bloodstream. So obviously that is a marked difference between 25 and 100. You saw twice the muscle protein synthesis. That's awesome, right? But you have to take into account, of course, that was 4 times the amount of protein. So to consume 4 times the amount of protein to get double the muscle protein synthesis, obviously double is good muscle protein synthesis, but if you had to ask me my honest opinion based on what I got out of this study, it is that smaller feedings are probably still better if you're trying to be more optimal and you want to get every advantage possible, as we've discussed. Then it is probably better to have more smaller meals. But it does seem obvious from this study that you can still function having these big feedings through intermittent fasting. But again, I want you to know the most important thing is the quality of the protein sources you're eating and the total intake of protein. All these other things can have some effect, but the most important things, the things that I really want you to worry about, is the quality of the protein and the total protein intake. The last couple things I wanted to talk about, first off, is the idea of, it's something called rabbit poisoning. And how I'd put this in layman's terms is an overconsumption of protein. Is it possible to overconsume on protein? Well, probably not. I don't think most people are going to have that happen to them unless they are probably following like the carnivore diet. But even still, if you're following the carnivore diet, I know many carnivores like to embrace kind of high-fat foods, and so you're probably still getting a decent amount of calories, so that way your total protein intake is not crazy. I would say that, let me explain rabbit poisoning. You're still probably, this whole time I've been talking, been like, what does that even mean? And it actually was an idea that came from, I think in Europe or something. There was this town or group of people basically where all they really had to eat was rabbits. They were poor and they didn't have great farming land, but there were tons of rabbits everywhere. And so all they ate all the time were rabbits. And rabbit is actually a very lean protein. It's not very high in fat at all. And so when all of your food all day, all week comes from rabbit, you probably are getting all of your calories from protein, which means obviously your body has the amount of protein that it is going to need to maintain your tissues and everything. However, we've already discussed that proteins can be turned into glucose molecules and they can be turned into lipids and fatty acids, right? That can be done. But we've also talked about the deamination of amino acids, right? If you take off that amine group of an amino acid to turn it into a glucose or to turn it into a fatty acid, something has to happen to that nitrogen-containing amine group. And what often happens, or what can happen in the body, is that amine group turns into ammonia, which can be very, very bad for you. Now, our bodies will create a substance out of the nitrogen-containing amine groups called urea, U-R-E-A, urea. And urea is nitrogen-containing, but is much safer for the body. And then urea is filtered out by the kidneys and excreted in the urine. However, there comes a point where our body is going to not be able to keep up with the amount of protein we are eating, not be able to make enough urea. There's going to be a little bit of ammonia in the blood then, and the kidneys are going to get tired, and the kidneys are going to get perhaps a little bit of toxicity from the amount of urea and the amount of ammonia, and that is rabbit poisoning. Really what it is it's nitrogen or ammonia poisoning, but rabbit poisoning is just the term that we use in nutritional science and just the overconsumption of protein. I don't think that is going to happen until you start consuming probably double your body weight in grams of protein. So 2 grams of protein per pound of body weight. It is possible, but it's definitely not something that I think is going to be very common at all, right? There is actually a certain amount of fear-mongering that gets done, online especially, about how people will say, oh, well, if you consume too high protein in a day, it's going to hurt your kidneys. And I don't think that's true at all. If you consume way, way, way too high, then yes, but definitely if you're consuming 0.75 grams per pound of body weight, 1 gram per pound of body weight, I do not think that you are going to be getting rabbit poisoning at all. I don't think that's a concern that you need to have in any way. And I just want to make myself clear on that. The very last thing I wanted to talk about today is the protein intake guidelines for growing children. Now, we've already talked about, the RDA for adults set at 0.8 grams per kilogram is just to maintain a net zero nitrogen balance. However, children who are growing need to have a positive nitrogen balance so that they can create new tissues, so they can grow bigger and taller and stronger. Children grow very, very fast. And so actually the younger the child, the higher the protein intake guideline is per kilogram of body weight. Obviously, a smaller child has less total body weight, but per pound of body weight or per kilogram of body weight, the younger the child is, the higher the protein intake needs to be. And so I just wanted to discuss these with you really quickly. During infancy, meaning the first year of a child's life, the recommended protein intake is 1.5 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. Mind you, that's actually about double the RDA for adults. That is 0.7 grams per pound of body weight. Now, I actually think that's a cool way to kind of frame our protein intake as adults, because infants, during that first year of life, they grow very, very fast, right? As a bodybuilder, as a whoever, someone going to the gym, as an athlete, you are never going to be able to replicate the amount of tissue growth and protein synthesis of an infant in their first year of life. Yet, in infancy, the RDA for protein is only 0.7 grams of protein per pound. Now, that means that if at 1 year old, this infant weighs 20 pounds, that's only 14 grams of protein a day. That is really, really not that much food at all. During early childhood, which is about 1 to 4, so kind of like toddler-aged children, the recommended protein intake is 1.1 grams per kilogram, or about 0.5 grams per pound. And as you already know, that is my recommended intake for everybody, is you should be having about 0.5 grams per pound. But then in that stage, if that child weighs 40 pounds, that is only 20 grams of protein. 20 grams of protein is an incredibly small portion of chicken breast. It is just a few glasses of milk. That is very, very easy and doable for children. In late childhood, meaning like school-age children, so this is probably, 6 to 10, right? The recommended protein intake is 1 gram per kilogram, or about 0.5 grams per pound. If you had an 80-pound child, that would be 36 grams of protein. And then during adolescence, the guideline that I was able to find didn't actually give me a number, but it said that it was slightly higher than adults. We know that adult is set at 0.8, late childhood is set at 1, so we could say that perhaps it's 0.9 for adolescents, but again, at this point, I've already told you that I recommend a protein intake that is actually equivalent with the intake for early childhood, or about 1 to 4 years old. So at that point, I'm not really worried about it. That is definitely a bare minimum. But I hope to just let you know that maybe if any parents listening, they're kind of thinking about how much protein they're going to consume, but maybe we're curious how much their children should be consuming. And I want you to know that even though it is higher, obviously because children are so small, it's really not a very complicated thing. It's not very hard for them to get that much protein. And then again, key takeaways, I think everybody should be eating at least 0.5 grams of protein per pound. 0.75 would be awesome. And if you really, really, really want to give it your all, you have a very high athletic goal, I'd say 1 gram per pound. I hope you've learned something in today's episode, Nutrition 101. Loved making it. It was great. Obviously, this is everybody's favorite topic in sports and nutrition is protein. Thank you for joining me on today's episode. This has been the Science of Sports Performance.